The tremors began in my hands. It wasn't the familiar bone-deep exhaustion from lifting my mother's dead weight or the dull ache from another night spent on the lumpy couch by her bed. This was something new. A high-frequency vibration, a prelude to an earthquake I had been subconsciously expecting for 15 years. It all started with a piece of paper. Not even a letter, really. It was a notice delivered in a stiff, cream-colored envelope with the seal of the city of Buffalo, New York, stamped on it like a brand. The official font, cold and impersonal, leaped off the page, each word a punch to the gut. Eminent domain. Urban redevelopment. Demolition scheduled. The sentences swam in a blur of bureaucratic jargon, but the message was brutally simple. Our house, this mausoleum of memory and sickness I had been chained to for half my life, was going to be destroyed. They were tearing it down to make way for a new light rail expansion project, a monument to a future I would never be a part of. A sound, a strangled gasp, escaped my throat. I looked over at my mother Helen, sitting in her specialized wheelchair by the window that overlooked a dying maple tree. Her body, a prison of atrophied muscles and failed nerves, was still. But her eyes, those brilliant blue pools of trapped consciousness, were fixed on me. They were the only part of her that ALS hadn't stolen yet, and in their depths I saw my own panic reflected back. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even weep, but she knew. In the silent, terrifying language we had developed over the last decade, her eyes screamed. The house was more than just wood and plaster. It was our fortress, our hospital, our world. Every modification, from the wheelchair ramp that had splintered my father's hands to build to the reinforced ceiling hooks for the hoist in her bedroom, was a testament to our battle against her disease. The layout was mapped in my muscle memory: 7 steps from her bed to the bathroom, 12 from the kitchen to the emergency oxygen tank, 3 to grab the suction machine when she started to choke. To be forced out was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The compensation amount listed at the bottom of the page was a joke. A cruel slap in the face. It wouldn't even cover a year's stay in a mediocre nursing home, let alone one equipped to handle the final brutal stages of her illness. My blood ran cold, then hot. The tremor in my hands intensified and the paper rattled as if in a gale. For 15 years I had been Amelia, the dutiful daughter. The saint, the martyr. I had surrendered my scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design, my dreams of color and canvas, my youth. I had traded it all for the stench of antiseptic, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, and the crushing, suffocating silence of this house. And I had done it quietly, but this piece of paper, this soulless declaration from the city, had just lit a fuse to a powder keg of resentment that had been packed tight within me for 5 days. My first thought, my only thought, was of him, Ethan, my brother. The brilliant lawyer in his glass tower in Los Angeles, the golden son who had escaped Buffalo the moment he could, leaving the wreckage of our family in his rearview mirror. He had built his entire glorious life on the foundation of my sacrifice, and he didn't even know it. Or more likely, he didn't care to know. My fingers, clumsy with rage, fumbled with my phone. I had to go outside to the porch to get a signal, the thick plaster walls of the old house seemingly designed to keep the outside world at bay. The air was thick with the humid promise of a summer storm. I dialed his number, a number I knew by heart but rarely used. It usually went to voicemail. This time he answered on the second ring. The sound of his voice was jarring, too clear, too full of life. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders, to being listened to. I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass, the low hum of conversation in the background. He was at a client dinner or a cocktail party or one of the 1,000 other glamorous events that constituted his world. My world was a 1,200 square foot house that smelled of decay. I told him about the letter. My voice was thin, reedy, a stranger's voice. I explained the situation in clipped, urgent sentences, the words tumbling out of me before my courage could fail. I told him about the demolition, the insultingly low compensation, the sheer impossibility of our situation. There was a pause on his end. I imagined him swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance at this interruption from his past. He finally spoke, his tone dripping with the condescending patience of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. He told me not to panic, that it was just a bureaucratic issue. He said this was probably a blessing in disguise, a chance to finally move on. He told me to just take the money. Find a good nursing home for Mom. He would handle the cost, he assured me, as if money was the only language he knew, the only solution to any problem. He said he would send a check. A check. The words echoed in the cavernous empty space in my chest. He thought he could solve this with a check. He thought he could write a few numbers on a piece of paper and absolve himself of 15 years of abandonment. He thought Mom's life, my life, could be outsourced, paid for, and forgotten like a utility bill. Something inside me snapped. The quiet, accommodating Amelia, who had swallowed her bitterness for years, died right there on that crumbling porch. In her place, a cold, sharp-edged fury was born. I told him no. The word felt foreign, powerful on my tongue. I told him he didn't understand, that he couldn't possibly understand. I told him putting Mom in a home was not an option, that I had promised Dad on his deathbed that we would keep her here surrounded by the life she knew until the very end. His patience evaporated. His voice hardened. He told me I was being emotional and impractical. He accused me of being selfish, of holding on to the past. And then he delivered the final, fatal blow. He told me that he had a life, a career he had worked hard for, and that I had chosen to stay behind. Chosen. The word hung in the air between Los Angeles and Buffalo, a toxic cloud of ignorance and arrogance. I had chosen this. This life of bedpans and feeding tubes, this life of watching my own reflection in the window grow gaunt and gray. He truly believed it. He had constructed a narrative where he was the ambitious success and I was the timid homebody too scared to leave. The neatness of it must have helped him sleep at night in his $1 million condo. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. My rage was too pure, too cold for that now. It had crystallized into something hard and clear, a purpose. He needed to be educated. He needed to be stripped of his comfortable delusions one by one. He needed to walk a mile in my worn-out shoes on the splintered floors of this condemned house. He needed to see, to touch, to smell the reality of the sacrifice he had never been asked to make. I told him very calmly that his solution was not a solution at all, and that if he wanted to have any say in our mother's fate, he needed to come here. He needed to see it for himself. There was a long, exasperated sigh on the other end of the line. I could picture him pinching the bridge of his nose, angry at the inconvenience. He probably thought I was being hysterical. He grumbled about a big case, about commitments he couldn't possibly break. But I held my ground. I didn't raise my voice. I just repeated my point. I told him that if he didn't come, I would handle it myself, and that he would have to live with the consequences of whatever I decided. It was a bluff, but it was delivered with the conviction of a woman with nothing left to lose. I think he heard it in my voice. The absence of pleading, the presence of something steely he hadn't heard before. He finally relented, his voice sharp with annoyance. He told me he would fly in that weekend. He would clear his schedule, come to Buffalo, and in his words, fix this mess once and for all. He made it sound like he was the parent and I was the troublesome child who had made a scene. I told him that was fine and hung up before he could say another word. I walked back into the house. The air inside felt different, charged. The familiar hum of the medical equipment sounded like a drumbeat counting down. I went to my mother's wheelchair and knelt before her. I took her limp, cool hand in mine. Her fingers were curled into a permanent claw, but I held them anyway. I looked into her eyes, which were wide and searching, filled with 1,000 unsaid questions. I didn't offer her false comfort. I didn't tell her everything would be all right. Instead, I made her a silent promise. I told her through the pressure of my hand and the intensity of my gaze that Ethan was coming home. But he wasn't coming home to save us. He was coming home to face a reckoning. The eviction notice wasn't an end. It was a beginning. It was the weapon I never knew I had, and I was going to use it to demolish the comfortable gilded world he had built brick by gilded brick. The era of the silent martyr was over. The education of Ethan was about to begin. The 2 days before Ethan's arrival were the longest of my life. The house, usually a place of stagnant, suffocating routine, was now humming with a strange, nervous energy. A storm was coming, and I was the one who had summoned it. I didn't clean in the frantic way one does for guests. Instead, I curated. I left the pile of medical supply boxes in the hallway. I didn't hide the stained towel under the sink that I used to wipe up Mom's spills. I didn't spray air freshener to mask the raw, layered scent of antiseptic medication and human frailty. This house was not a home to be presented. It was a piece of evidence to be examined. Every corner was a testament to my imprisonment, and I wanted him to see the bars. I moved through my tasks with a chilling, newfound clarity. Feeding Mom, changing her, suctioning her throat, the actions were the same, but the feeling was different. The resentment that had simmered for 15 years had cooled into something solid and purposeful. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was an archivist of sacrifice, preparing my exhibit for its sole mandatory visitor. I would look at my mother, her body inert but her eyes tracking my every move, and I felt a silent pact pass between us. She was the reason for my sacrifice, but Ethan's ignorance was the reason for my rage. He arrived on Saturday afternoon, not in a humble taxi, but in a gleaming black rental sedan that looked alien and predatory, parked on our cracked and weed-choked driveway. He stepped out and the contrast was almost comical. He wore a pair of expensive jeans, a crisp linen shirt, and sunglasses that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. He smelled of money, of cologne, of a world where problems were delegated and discomfort was avoided. He was a creature from another ecosystem, and he was stepping into my swamp. He paused on the porch, his polished leather shoe hesitating before touching the rotting wood. He surveyed the peeling paint and the overgrown rose bushes. My father had planted, his expression a mixture of pity and disgust. That look, more than any word he could have spoken, stoked the cold fire in my gut. He walked in without knocking, pulling a rolling suitcase behind him as if he were checking into a hotel. The first thing he did was wrinkle his nose. He told me the place smelled like a hospital. His voice was not accusatory, just observational, a statement from a man used to environments scrubbed clean of life's unpleasant realities. That single comment sent a jolt through my memory, throwing me back 20 years. I was 18, standing in a real hospital corridor that smelled of floor wax and fear. My mother Helen had just been diagnosed. The doctor, a man with tired eyes, had used the words progressive, incurable, no known cause. I remember the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the squeak of a gurney's wheels down the hall. My father, a strong, practical man who fixed everything with his hands, stood beside me, looking utterly broken, his big frame seeming to shrink before my eyes. Ethan was there too, home for a weekend from his pre-law program. I remembered him pacing, running a hand through his perfect hair, not talking about what this meant for Mom, but what it meant for his summer internship applications. He'd asked if this would be a long-term financial drain. Even then, his first instinct was to assess the problem in terms of its cost to him. That was the moment our paths had truly forked. He was already building his escape route while I was unknowingly digging the foundations of my prison. Back in the present, I simply nodded in response to his comment about the smell. I told him he'd get used to it. He walked past me into the living room, his eyes scanning everything, assessing, judging. He saw Mom in her wheelchair positioned by the window. He approached her with the awkwardness of a stranger. He said hello to her, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful, the way people speak to the very old or the very young. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, a performative gesture that held no warmth. He didn't look into her eyes. If he had, he would have seen the storm raging there. He saw a broken body, an object of pity. He didn't see my co-conspirator. He straightened up and turned to me, all business. He told me he'd been on the phone all morning with a service that finds premium elder care facilities. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket, ready to show me a list of places with names like Golden Meadows and Serenity Gardens. Places with glossy websites and pictures of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing bingo. He spoke of them as if he were presenting a portfolio of real estate investments. He told me they had excellent staff-to-patient ratios and specialized neurological wings. He was trying to fix this mess just as he'd promised. I let him talk. I watched as he swiped through images of manicured lawns and bright, sterile rooms. Each picture was a lie, a sanitized fantasy designed to soothe the guilt of wealthy, absent children. He was so confident, so sure of his solution. He was the tiger swooping in to save his helpless sister from the jungle she was lost in, a paper tiger. When he finally finished his presentation, he looked at me expecting gratitude or at the very least compliance. He asked which one I thought looked best. I didn't answer his question. Instead, I told him that before we looked at brochures for places she would never go, I wanted to give him a tour. He looked confused. A tour of what? This tiny, decaying house he grew up in. I told him it was a tour of his mother's life. My life. I started in the living room. I walked him over to the mechanical hoist bolted into the ceiling. I ran my hand over the cold metal. I explained to him that this was how I got our 110-pound mother from her chair to her bed twice a day every day. I told him about the time the power went out and she was stuck halfway suspended in the air for an hour, her eyes wide with terror while I frantically tried to work the manual crank. I made sure to hold his gaze as I spoke. Next, I took him to the kitchen. I opened the pantry. It wasn't filled with food, but with boxes of feeding tubes, cases of nutrient formula, sterile wipes, and suction catheters. I picked up a bag of the beige, clinical-smelling liquid. I told him this was his mother's food. 3 times a day, I poured this into a bag that dripped directly into her stomach. I told him I hadn't cooked a real meal in 5 years. Why bother when I always ate alone, standing over the sink? I led him to the small bathroom, pointing out the grab bars on the walls, the elevated toilet seat, the shower chair. I described in methodical, dispassionate detail the daily humiliation of cleaning a body that could no longer clean itself. I spared him nothing. I wanted to paint a picture so vivid it would be seared into his memory. I saw the color draining from his face. The confident lawyer was disappearing, replaced by a pale, uncomfortable man who was clearly out of his depth. The final stop on my tour was our father's old study. It was the one room I had kept exactly as he'd left it, a dusty shrine to a man who had worked himself into an early grave. Ethan's framed university and law school diplomas hung on the wall, cleaned and polished, in stark contrast to the dust-covered family photos on the desk. Ethan seemed to relax slightly in here, surrounded by the evidence of his own success. He ran a hand over his law degree, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. He told me he remembered the night Dad hung it, how proud he had been. He said Dad had always believed in him, had always told him he was meant for bigger things than Buffalo, and had given him the seed money to start his own life without being burdened by debt. The arrogance of that statement, the sheer unadulterated ignorance, was breathtaking. The dam inside me finally broke. I walked over to the old wooden filing cabinet in the corner, the key making a grinding sound in the rusty lock. I pulled out a dusty accordion file labeled Household Unpaid. I blew a layer of dust off the top and placed it on the desk right next to a smiling photo of our parents from their wedding day. I told him I wanted to show him where his seed money really came from. His smile faltered. He looked at the file, then back at me, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. I opened it. Inside were not household receipts, but something else entirely. There were letters from banks written in threatening red ink, notices of a second mortgage taken out on the house, statements from high-interest credit cards all maxed out, and loan documents taken out against my father's already dwindling retirement fund. It was a paper trail of quiet desperation, a story of a proud man trying to keep his family afloat after his contracting business went under during the recession, all while shielding his golden son from the ugly truth. I let him look through them. I watched his face as the narrative of his life was systematically dismantled page by yellowing page. His seed money wasn't a gift. It was the last bit of blood my father had to give, drained from the family's future to secure his. He sank into our father's old leather chair, the papers spread before him like wreckage. He looked smaller, diminished. He told me, his voice barely a whisper, that he didn't know. That Dad had told him the business was fine, that everything was fine. I looked at him, at the diplomas on the wall, at the ghost of the man who had worked himself to death to hang them there. The first layer of his armor was gone. He now knew his success was built not on a solid foundation but on a mountain of our father's secret debt. But he still didn't know the whole story. He didn't know about the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle. He didn't know about the sacrifice that had truly paid for his freedom. I left him there in the silent, dusty room, surrounded by the ghosts of his own convenient lies. I closed the door behind me, leaving him to suffocate on the truth. The first lesson was over. I went to check on my mother. Her eyes were closed, but I knew she wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. We both were. Silence is a living thing in this house. For years it had been a heavy, suffocating blanket. But the silence that seeped from under the study door after I left Ethan with our father's financial ruin was different. It was a taut, humming silence, vibrating with the frequency of a man's world being unmade. I went about my routine, preparing Mom's afternoon nutrient feed, my hands moving with an eerie calm. The tremors had ceased. In their place was a profound and terrible stillness, the kind that comes before a lightning strike. I was no longer waiting for the storm. I was the storm. He was in there for nearly an hour. When he finally emerged, he was not the same man who had walked in. The Los Angeles tan on his skin seemed artificial, a thin veneer over a sickly pallor. His expensive linen shirt was rumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked hollowed out, as if the ghosts in that room had feasted on his arrogance. He found me in the living room, sitting on the floor beside Mom's wheelchair, holding her hand. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his gaze darting between the pile of damning paperwork still on Dad's desk, visible through the open door, and me. The powerful attorney was gone, replaced by a bewildered, defensive boy. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. He told me he couldn't believe it. He said Dad had lied to him, had lied to everyone. He kept repeating that he would have helped, that they should have told him the truth. He was trying to reframe the narrative, to cast himself as another victim of our father's pride. He was making it about his ignorance, not their sacrifice. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to claw back some moral high ground, and it was the last matchstick I needed to light the final, most devastating fire. I looked up at him from the floor, my expression utterly blank. I let his excuses hang in the dead air, letting their weakness and selfishness become apparent even to him. I told him he was right about one thing. Dad had lied. But he hadn't just lied about the money. He had lied about the true cost of that diploma hanging on the wall. The financial cost was only the down payment. The real price was paid with a different currency. He looked at me confused. The price he thought the revelation of the debt was the final act of this play. He had no idea the curtain was just rising on the main event. I stood up, my joints cracking in protest. I told him there was one more stop on the tour. I walked past him, my shoulder nearly brushing his, and headed towards my own bedroom at the back of the house. It wasn't a room, it was a cell. A small, cramped space with a single bed, a dresser, and walls that had once been painted a hopeful yellow but had faded to a sickly beige. For a moment, a wave of the old pain, the crushing weight of 15 lost years washed over me. I saw the ghost of the 18-year-old girl who had dreamed of painting sunsets over the ocean, now trapped in this gray, colorless existence. The suffering crested a familiar agony. But this time I pushed it down, weaponizing it. Under my bed was a flat gray portfolio box, the kind art students use. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. I pulled it out, the sound of it scraping against the floorboards echoing in the silent house. I carried it back to the living room and set it on the coffee table in front of him. It landed with a soft, final thud. He stared at it as if it were a bomb. I told him he had showed me his life's achievements on his phone, so it was only fair I show him mine. With deliberate slowness, I untied the black ribbon holding it closed and lifted the lid. The contents weren't dusty. I had kept them pristine, a museum of what could have been. On top was a single thick piece of stationery embossed with the seal of the Rhode Island School of Design. It was my letter of acceptance. Beneath it was another letter detailing the terms of the Presidential Merit Scholarship, a full ride. Tuition, housing, art supplies, everything. It was a golden ticket out of Buffalo, out of a life I knew was closing in on me. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note from the head of the painting department, a man whose work I idolized, telling me he had rarely seen a portfolio with so much raw promise. I didn't let Ethan touch them. I picked them up one by one and read the key phrases aloud, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. Each word was a perfectly aimed stone striking the glass house of his self-conception. Then I recounted the memory. I painted the picture for him. I described the day I received that letter, the feeling of holding a tangible future in my hands, a world of light and color and possibility. And then I described the day just 1 week later that Mom was diagnosed. I described sitting in this very living room, that acceptance letter on the table, listening to Dad on the phone, his voice cracking as he tried to figure out how he was going to pay for Ethan's final year of law school tuition now that his business had collapsed and Mom would need full-time care. I told him about the choice. It had never been a choice, not really. It was an inevitability. I could take my golden ticket and run, leaving my broken father to sell this house and put my mother in a state-run facility while he worked himself to death to pay for his son's ambition. Or I could stay. I could tear up my future, throw it into the fire, and use the ashes to patch the holes in our sinking ship. A sound tore from Ethan's throat, a raw, animalistic noise of pure anguish. He staggered back as if I had physically struck him. He kept shaking his head, whispering that it wasn't true, but he knew it was. I told him how I had taken a job as a waitress and another as a night shift receptionist, how I'd quietly paid off Dad's high-interest loans with cash, telling him it was a grant I'd received, how my art supplies were sold, my canvases thrown away. I described the moment I officially declined the scholarship, the click of the send button on the email, feeling like a gunshot in the silent room. I told him, my voice dropping to a near whisper, that the day he walked across the stage to receive his law degree, I was at home changing our mother's soiled bedsheets for the first time. His triumph was built quite literally on my filth and my failure. This was the peak. The absolute summit of my pain laid bare for him to see. 15 years of swallowed screams of bitter tears shed in the dark of dreams that rotted into nightmares. I had served it all up to him on a silver platter of truth. And as I watched him crumble, something miraculous happened inside me. The agony didn't just recede, it evaporated. The tight burning knot of resentment I had carried in my chest for a decade and a half simply dissolved. The ghost of the 18-year-old girl finally stopped weeping. In its place, a profound, clean, and exhilarating satisfaction bloomed. It was the feeling of a misaligned bone finally snapping back into place. It was the feeling of a debt long past due being paid in full with interest in the currency of his suffering. This was not joy. It was justice. He slid down the wall, burying his face in his hands, his body racked with shuddering guttural sobs. He was weeping for the brother he could have been, for the sister he had never known, for the life he had so carelessly, so ignorantly consumed. I looked over at Mom. A single perfect tear was tracing a path through the fine wrinkles on her cheek. Her eyes were fixed on her son. She was my silent witness, my final, irrefutable piece of evidence. I watched him cry for a full 5 minutes. I felt nothing but a cold, clear sense of balance being restored to the universe. When his sobs finally subsided into ragged gasps, I walked over to the portfolio box. I carefully placed the letters back inside, tied the ribbon, and slid the lid on. The museum was now closed. I stood over my broken brother. His education was far from over, but the first 2 lessons had been brutally effective. He now knew his life was a lie built on the foundations of our father's ruin and my surrendered future. It was time for his practical exam. I didn't offer him a hand. I didn't offer him a word of comfort. I simply looked down at him and stated a fact. I told him it was 5 o'clock. It was time for his mother's dinner. The nutrient bag, the feeding pump, and the instructions were in the kitchen. I told him he should get started. My order hung in the air, simple and absolute. It was not a request. I had not asked him to help. I had instructed him to fulfill his duty. For the first time, he was not the one delegating, but the one being told what to do. He stared at me, his face a mess of tear tracks and confusion, as if he didn't comprehend the words. I merely gestured toward the kitchen, my expression unyielding. My pain was no longer a private burden. It was now his curriculum, and class was in session. He stumbled to his feet and walked into the kitchen like a zombie. I followed, not to assist, but to supervise. I was the drill instructor. He was the terrified new recruit. The components were laid out on the counter: the sterile bag, the coiled tube, the imposing feeding pump with its various buttons and dials, and the can of beige nutrient formula. To me, this was as routine as making a cup of coffee. To him, it was complex, alien, and deeply unsettling. He picked up the can of formula, his hands, which were accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, shaking so badly he could barely open it. He fumbled with the bag, trying to pour the liquid in, and promptly spilled a significant amount on the counter. The thick, sickly sweet smell filled the small room. He swore under his breath, grabbing a paper towel to sop up the mess, his movements clumsy and agitated. I remained silent, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. I did not offer to help. I let him struggle. This was the first lesson, the cost of incompetence. Every mistake he made was a small echo of the thousands of near misses and frantic moments I had navigated alone. He finally managed to fill the bag and connect it to the pump. He looked at the machine, utterly lost. He asked me what to do next. My voice was flat, clinical. I told him to prime the tube to get the air out, then set the flow rate to 150 milliliters per hour. I used the technical terms, deliberately offering no simplified explanation. I watched him jab at the buttons, his frustration mounting as the machine beeped in protest at his incorrect inputs. After several failed attempts, he turned to me, his voice tight with desperation, and told me he couldn't do it. I walked over, pushed him aside, and programmed the machine in under 10 seconds. The pump began its quiet, rhythmic whir. I told him the next step was to connect the tube to Mom. He flinched. The idea of performing this intimate, invasive procedure was clearly horrifying to him. I reminded him that his mother was waiting. He approached her wheelchair, his movements hesitant. I explained how to flush her G-tube with water first, then connect the feeding line. His hands trembled as he handled the medical equipment near her stomach. He was so terrified of hurting her that his fumbling made it worse. Mom's eyes were wide, fixed on his face. She was not afraid. She was watching him, judging him. Finally, with a click, the tube was connected. The machine began its work, pushing life-sustaining fluid into the mother he barely knew. Ethan sagged against the wall, sweating, looking as though he'd just performed open-heart surgery. I told him he would need to do this again at 10 o'clock that night and at 6 the next morning, and that he would also be responsible for the 2-hour flush in between. The look of dread that washed over his face was my first true taste of victory. It was not just satisfaction, it was validation. I had made the invisible visible. That night was the second lesson: there is no respite. I went to my room but did not sleep. I listened. Around 2 a.m., I heard the soft gurgling sound from Mom's room, a sound that always shot ice through my veins. It meant fluid was backing up in her throat, a prelude to choking. I waited. I counted the seconds, listening for Ethan's response. There was none. He was asleep, exhausted from his day of emotional turmoil, oblivious to the subtle language of impending crisis. I got up and walked to his room. I didn't knock. I just opened the door. He was sprawled on the bed, deeply asleep. I said his name sharply. He jolted awake, disoriented. I told him that Mom was in distress and that he needed to suction her. The panic in his eyes was immediate. He had no idea what to do. He followed me to her room where the gurgling was louder now. I pointed to the suction machine. I told him to do it. He stood frozen, a statue of uselessness. With a sigh of performative exasperation, I pushed him out of the way, switched on the machine, and expertly cleared her airway. The terrifying sound stopped, replaced by the steady rhythm of her breathing. I turned to him, my voice cold. I told him that if I hadn't been awake, she could have aspirated, that she could have died. I let the weight of that statement settle on his shoulders. I told him that this was my reality every single night, that I didn't truly sleep, I monitored. I had for years. His face was ashen in the dim glow of the nightlight. The next morning, his world tried to reclaim him. His phone, which had been mostly silent, began to buzz incessantly. He ignored the first few calls, but then a name flashed on the screen that made him answer. It was his senior partner. I watched from the kitchen as he tried to regain his composure, his voice shifting back into the smooth, confident cadence of Ethan the lawyer. He spoke of motions, of depositions, of a critical upcoming trial. He was trying to escape back into the reality where he was powerful and in control. I decided it was time for the final and most important lesson: your world no longer matters here. As he was deep in conversation, promising his partner he would be back in LA by Tuesday to handle everything, I walked calmly to the main circuit breaker in the hallway. I knew this house and its frailties better than anyone. With a decisive flick of my wrist, I cut the power to the entire house. The lights went out. The refrigerator fell silent. And most importantly, the rhythmic whir of Mom's feeding pump and the soft hiss of her oxygen concentrator stopped. Ethan's phone call ended abruptly. He yelled out, asking what had happened. I walked back into the living room, my face a mask of concern. I told him the old breaker must have tripped again, that it happens sometimes. The silence was suddenly terrifying. Mom's breathing was becoming labored without the supplemental oxygen. He stared at me, then at her, his legal problems in Los Angeles instantly forgotten, replaced by a primal, immediate fear. He asked what we were supposed to do. This was my moment. This was the move I had been planning. I told him to stay with her while I made a call. I didn't go for the power company. I walked to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and in front of him I dialed the number for the City of Buffalo's Urban Redevelopment Authority, the number from the eviction notice. Ethan stared at me, bewildered. He asked what on earth I was doing. I held up a hand to silence him. A man answered, and I began to speak, my voice a perfect blend of weary resignation and steely determination. I told the man my name and address. I told him I was calling about the eminent domain notice. I said I was prepared to accept their offer. Ethan lunged forward, whispering frantically, telling me I was crazy, that the offer was nothing, that we couldn't accept it. I ignored him. I continued, telling the man on the phone that my acceptance was of course conditional. I explained that I was the sole caregiver for my terminally ill mother, who required 24,000 7-inch home medical support, including electronic equipment that was currently non-functional due to the neighborhood's unreliable power grid, a problem that would surely be documented in utility company records. I mentioned conversationally that the city's current compensation offer was insultingly inadequate to secure equivalent housing with the necessary medical modifications. I added that I had already made preliminary calls to the local news about the city's plan to displace a disabled senior, and that I was preparing a formal complaint with several disability rights advocacy groups. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I then told him that I was sure the mayor's office wouldn't want the human cost of their shiny new light rail project to become a public relations nightmare. I suggested politely that a significantly revised offer, along with a city-provided relocation specialist, might be in everyone's best interest. I listened for a moment, then said thank you and hung up. I turned to face my brother. The look on his face was my masterpiece. It was a complex portrait of shock, awe, and utter defeat. He, the high-powered lawyer, had planned to swoop in with his checkbook and his list of nursing homes. He had come to fix my problem. But he had just witnessed his quiet, downtrodden sister, with no resources and no legal training, strategically corner the city of Buffalo into a position of weakness, using nothing but the truth and a well-placed threat. I hadn't just handled the situation. I had outmaneuvered him at his own game. I walked back to the circuit breaker and flipped the power on. The lights flickered to life, and the life-sustaining machines began to hum again. I looked at Ethan, whose own world had just been plunged into darkness. I told him I was glad he was here to see that, because from now on I would be handling all the negotiations. He was no longer the savior. He wasn't even a consultant. He was just an assistant caregiver, and he still had a lot to learn. The aftermath of my phone call was an entirely new kind of silence. It was the dead, airless quiet that follows a controlled demolition. Ethan, the towering edifice of self-assurance, had been reduced to rubble. He stood in the middle of the living room, a ghost in his own past, staring at me not with anger but with a terrifyingly blank expression. It was the look of a man who had just realized the map he'd been using his whole life was a lie, and he was hopelessly, irrevocably lost. He didn't speak for what felt like hours. The normal sounds of the house, the hum of the oxygen machine, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed unnaturally loud, marking the time in a world he no longer understood. I didn't press him. The point of my performance wasn't just to demonstrate my competence, it was to obliterate his. I had held up a mirror, and in it he had finally seen himself not as the family's savior but as its heaviest, most oblivious burden. His phone began buzzing again, a frantic, insistent vibration against the wooden coffee table. It was his world calling the world of deadlines and demands, the world where he was important. He looked at the glowing screen, his face a mask of paralysis. The call was from his fiancée, a woman named Chloe, whom I'd never met but had pictured 1,000 times, perfectly manicured, successful, a fitting accessory to his perfect life. He let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. His partner. He ignored that one too. The paper tiger had lost its roar. The master negotiator had been rendered speechless. I left him to his silent unraveling and went to tend to Mom. As I adjusted her pillows, I met her gaze. Her blue eyes, usually calm pools of resignation, were alight with a fierce, brilliant intensity. She had seen it all. She had heard the phone call. She had watched her son, the one who had flown away, be brought crashing back to earth by the daughter who had stayed. In the subtle twitch of her lips, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, a shadow of a smile. It was a small, devastating acknowledgement of my victory. We were a silent army of two, and we had just won the war. Eventually, Ethan moved. He walked like an old man, his shoulders slumped, his feet shuffling, and collapsed into our father's worn armchair. He didn't look at me. He looked at his own hands, turning them over and over as if they belonged to a stranger. When he finally spoke, his voice was a choked, broken thing. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to defend himself. He just started asking questions, each one a confession of his willful blindness. He asked me when Dad had gotten so sick before he died. He asked if Mom ever talked about him. He asked what I did on my birthday. Simple, fundamental questions about the life of his family, questions he had never once thought to ask over 15 years of cheerful, superficial phone calls and holiday cards with checks tucked inside. I answered him. I didn't embellish or editorialize. I just gave him the facts, each one a fresh wound. I told him Dad's heart attack hadn't been sudden. He'd been having chest pains for 6 months but refused to see a doctor because he didn't want to spend the money. I told him Mom couldn't talk, but she used to stare at his picture on the mantelpiece for hours, especially after he'd call a single tear, sometimes tracking down her cheek. I told him that for my last 10 birthdays I had bought a single cupcake from the grocery store and eaten it in my car in the parking lot just to have 5 minutes of being somewhere else. The raw, unvarnished truth was more brutal than any accusation I could have leveled. He wasn't just a traitor, he was an irrelevance, a ghost haunting the periphery of a life he had abandoned. He had outsourced his love, his grief, and his responsibility for so long that he had forgotten how to feel any of it. He had sent money to pay for our father's funeral, but he hadn't been there to hold my hand as they lowered the casket into the frozen buffalo ground. He began to weep again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the shocked, guttural sob of a man whose pride had been wounded. It was the quiet, hopeless weeping of a man mourning a life he had never lived, a family he had never truly known. He was mourning his own soul. He told me through his tears that he was sorry. The words were small and inadequate pebbles thrown into a canyon of neglect, but for the first time I believed he meant them. The satisfaction I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. My revenge had been surgical and precise. I had stripped him of his arrogance, his ignorance, and his self-delusion. But now, looking at the broken man in my father's chair, I realized the final, cruelest part of my plan. I had wanted to make him feel what I felt. And now he did. He was trapped. His glamorous life in LA, his important career, his beautiful fiancée, all of it now seemed like a hollow fiction. The only real thing in the world was this dying house, this dying woman, and the sister whose entire life was a monument to his absence. The next day, a Monday, the city called back. It was a different person, a woman from the deputy mayor's office with a calm, professional voice. She informed me that they were re-evaluating their offer and that a relocation specialist would be in touch. She treated me with a deference and respect that bordered on fear. The news, which should have felt like a triumph, barely registered. The real drama was unfolding in the living room. Chloe, the fiancée, had apparently had enough of being ignored. She began calling every 10 minutes, her texts escalating from concerned to annoyed to furious. Finally, Ethan answered, his voice weary. I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but I could see it reflected on his face. He was pale, his expression pained. He kept telling her he couldn't explain it over the phone, that he couldn't leave yet, that it was complicated. There were long pauses where he just listened, his eyes closed, absorbing her anger and frustration. He was a world away, and his world was demanding his return. He told her that he was sorry, that he would call her back. He hung up the phone and looked at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of horror. He was seeing the chasm that had opened up between his two lives. I knew in that moment that I had won more than just a better compensation package. I had broken the spell. I had forced him to see the true cost of his life, and that knowledge was a poison that would now infect everything he touched. He could go back to Los Angeles, but he would never truly be back. He would sit in his glass tower and see this dusty, dying room. He would look at his beautiful fiancée and see my tired, gray face. He would celebrate a legal victory and remember that his career was paid for by my forfeited dreams. He was in shock, a man in a waking nightmare. He moved through the day in a daze, performing the caregiving tasks I assigned him with a robotic, fumbling obedience. He flushed her tube, he measured her formula, he sat by her chair. But he was a dead man walking. He was a traitor who had finally been forced to survey the kingdom he had betrayed, only to find it was the only home he had ever really had. And now he was trapped in its ruins with no one to blame but himself. The final days of Ethan's stay were not marked by explosive confrontations, but by a profound and heavy quiet. The house had absorbed his breakdown, and now it held us in a state of suspended animation. The demolition I had wrought upon him was complete. What remained was the painstaking work of sifting through the wreckage. He had canceled his flight back to Los Angeles, telling his partner and his fiancée that there was a family emergency that required his indefinite presence. It was the first honest thing he had told them in years, though they couldn't possibly comprehend the scope of the disaster. He no longer talked about fixing things. The language of solutions and strategies had been stripped from him. Instead, he learned the language of the house, the subtle shift in Mom's breathing that signaled discomfort, the specific timing of her medications, the hum of the concentrator that meant life was for another hour being sustained. He performed these tasks with a somber, focused diligence. It wasn't atonement, not yet. It was a penance born of shock, the mechanical motions of a man trying to find his footing on ground that had completely given way. One evening, as a cool rain whispered against the window panes, he found me in the kitchen staring into a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. He didn't sit down. He stood by the counter looking at the faded floral wallpaper, a pattern he must have seen tens of thousands of times as a child but was only now truly seeing. He told me, his voice low and raspy, that Chloe had left him. It wasn't a question but a flat statement. He explained that he had finally tried to tell her. Not everything, he couldn't bring himself to confess the full, ugly truth of my sacrificed life, but enough. He'd told her about Dad's debt, about Mom's true condition, about the fact that this house was being taken. He had tried to explain why he couldn't just write a check and walk away this time. Her reaction, he recounted, was one of cold, practical anger. She had apparently accused him of being dragged down by a toxic family situation. She had told him they had a life to build, a mortgage to pay, a social circle to maintain. She had given him an ultimatum: come home now and leave the past behind, or don't come home at all. He had chosen to stay. The life he had so meticulously constructed, the one designed to be airtight and free of the messy complications of his origins, had proven to be utterly brittle. It couldn't withstand the first tremor of genuine, ugly reality. He had been betrayed in his own way by the very world he had chosen over us. I felt nothing, no pity, no satisfaction. It was simply a consequence, a logical outcome. He had built a life on a foundation of lies, and a lie cannot support the weight of truth. Later that week, the relocation specialist from the city came to visit. She was a kind, efficient woman who spoke to me, and only me, with gentle respect. She laid out a portfolio of options: small, accessible houses in quiet suburban neighborhoods, with budgets for renovations to install ramps and ceiling hoists. Ethan sat in on the meeting, silent and peripheral, a shadow in the room. He listened as I discussed the logistics of moving Mom's medical equipment, my knowledge detailed and absolute. He was witnessing firsthand the expertise I had earned through 15 years of unpaid, unrelenting labor. He was seeing the intelligence and strength I had been forced to channel not into art or a career but into the simple, brutal act of keeping our mother alive. The betrayal he had inflicted was not a single act but a slow, creeping rot that had spread over a decade and a half. It was the betrayal of forgetting. He had forgotten the texture of our lives, the smell of our home, the sound of our father's laugh. He had edited his memory, curating a clean, simple story of his own ambition, conveniently omitting the footnotes that detailed the cost to others. My revenge was not to punish him, but to force him to read those footnotes aloud. The most profound lesson came on his last day. We had moved Mom to the living room so I could pack up her bedroom. Ethan was tasked with simply sitting with her. I watched them from the hallway. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't distracted. He was just there. He had pulled his chair close to hers, and for the first time he was truly looking at her. He was studying the lines on her face, the flicker of her eyelashes, the minute shifts in her expression. He started talking to her. He didn't speak in the loud, falsely cheerful voice he had used when he arrived. He spoke quietly, as if thinking aloud. He told her about his life in Los Angeles, but not the highlights he would put in a Christmas card. He told her about the pressure, the emptiness, the feeling of constantly performing. He told her he had a corner office with a view of the entire city, but he couldn't remember the last time he had actually looked out the window. He confessed that he had been running his whole life, and he didn't even know what he was running from anymore. And then he did something that shattered the last of my cold resolve. He reached out and took her hand. It was a limp, unresponsive thing, but he held it gently. He looked into her eyes, and his voice cracking, he told her he was sorry. He was sorry he hadn't been there. He was sorry he hadn't seen. He was sorry he had let me carry it all alone. From her wheelchair, my mother, who had not voluntarily moved a muscle in years, did the impossible. With what must have been a Herculean effort of will, she squeezed his hand. It was a faint, barely perceptible flutter, a neurological ghost in a deadened limb. But it was there. I saw it, and he felt it. A sob escaped him, a sound of such profound, gut-wrenching grief that it brought me to my knees in the hallway. He collapsed forward, laying his head in his mother's lap, and wept. It was a baptism of sorrow. In that moment, he was not the successful lawyer or the prodigal son. He was just a boy who had finally come home. I did not go to him. That moment was not for me. It was a sacred, silent transaction between a mother and her lost son. My plan had been to demolish him, to make him understand the depth of his betrayal, and I had succeeded. But I had never planned for what would come after. I had never planned for the possibility of grace. He left the next morning. There was no grand farewell. He just stood on the porch, his rental car waiting. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed and clear for the first time. He told me he would be back. He said he would help with the move, that he would set up a trust, that he would be present. They were promises, and I knew he might break them. But for the first time, I also knew he would try not to. The lesson I realized as I watched him drive away was not for him alone. It was for me, too. I had wrapped myself in my suffering for so long it had become my identity. My rage had been a shield protecting me from the crushing pain of my reality. But holding on to that rage was its own kind of prison. The betrayal had been real, the cost immense, but the future was now a blank page. The house would be torn down, and with it the monument to my sacrifice. I had a choice. I could build a new prison of bitterness, or I could try to learn after all these years how to be free. I walked back inside and went to my mother. I knelt by her chair and took her hand, the one that had squeezed her son's. I held it against my cheek. The house was quiet, but it was a different silence now. It was not empty. It was waiting. It was the echo of a life and the quiet promise of another.